morning. We are slowing down on people coming in. We're sitting at about 1450, so we're going to go ahead and begin this morning. I'm Corey Green. I'm the Associate Commissioner and Chief Grants Officer for Grant Compliance and Administration here at TEA. This morning, we're going to start our training series on the ESSER 3 program and application process. Today's training is specifically talking about the planning requirements, and primarily we're going to be looking at the compliance requirements that were implemented by U.S. Department of Education in the interim final rule. The interim final rule process is an emergency rulemaking process that the department was able to utilize to ensure they had a fast way to put out rules for a program without taking the normal 6-month rulemaking process. Today's training is provided for general information and guidance to LEAs, ESCs, and anyone else participating. I am not an attorney, so if you have legal questions, you need to refer those to your local legal counsel. And just so you're aware, the content of this presentation is based on the information available today. And as you all know, things in the federal program world do change on a regular basis. So everything we're talking about today is as it currently stands. Our agenda for this morning is going to be to look at some of the TEA planning resources that are available that TEA staff have been working on. And then we're going to go in and talk about the compliance requirements for the 2 plans that are required under ESSER. The first one being the LEA use of funds plan, and then the second one being the returned in-person instruction and continuity of services plan. If you want to get responses to your questions in writing, you need to submit them through the form that's at the link on your screen. And this link is also in the chat. We are updating the FAQ document almost daily. Right now, I'm about 90 questions behind, and after the training today, I'm sure that's going to more than double. But we do update questions pretty much on a daily basis. They are required to go through a review process. So once you submit a question, it will take a couple of days before you see the answer in the FAQ. Right now, I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions submitted from today's training, so it may take toward the end of the week to get caught up. But we will be looking at the questions you submit and providing responses to those as quick as possible. So the first thing up on the agenda this morning is to look at some of the TEA planning resources that are available to you, where if you're just not sure how to start this planning process, we do have resources that are available that you can utilize to help you get started and help you work through the process. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to switch over to Megha Kandra, who is going to talk about these resources that are available to you.
Good morning. My name is Megha Kandra. I am the Director of System Support and Innovation at the TEA. My team supports a number of district support and innovation efforts, and in particular, over the last school year, we've been supporting districts across Texas in COVID response and recovery. Including the Resilient School Support Program, which I know a number of you are a part of. So within the Resilient School Support Program, we've been supporting 78 LEAs in building a COVID recovery and learning acceleration plan, and also implementing with fidelity against that plan. So I wanted to share today a planning template that could be useful for those of you who are thinking about how to get started in strategically thinking about using your ESSER 3 funds. So I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to the planning template into the chat and also share my screen to just walk through this planning template. Here we go. All right, are folks able to see my screen with the workbook right now? Great. So at a high level, this is a very simplified planning template intended to support your leadership team in reflecting on key data and coming up with a funding plan that's truly aligned to your prioritize learning acceleration strategies as a district. So this template includes 4 tabs here. Right here at the start, we provide a little bit of an overview of the process we want to support you all in taking in the planning effort. So we want to support you first and foremost in reflecting on student data. So we know that to deeply understand our learning acceleration needs at districts, it's critical, if you haven't already done so, to really dive deep to understand, are there prioritized student groups, for example, campuses, grade levels, content areas, or even focus student groups, for example, English learners, who might have seen significant unfinished learning and where you might want to particularly focus efforts. The second step of the process is really to assess your system's readiness and needs against a set of research-based learning acceleration strategies. And then finally, the third step, which links to the key topic today, is to create a funding plan for your ESSER 3 funding use that's really aligned to what you've learned and deduced from steps 1 and 2. Now, just to dive into each of these tabs a little bit further, within the first tab, now this is that kind of optional first step, if you haven't already done so, to go ahead and do a little bit of reflection on your student data. We've got a document linked right here that you're welcome to click into that provides a little bit of additional guidance on choosing some of the highest leverage data points, particularly considering that in many cases, complete STAR data or recent STAR data may not be available. We have some suggestions for data that you might look at as a district. And then we provide a set of steps here to help you think about breaking down the data by key groups, by key populations. And then we have a set of reflection questions here to help you really take a moment and see which groups of students might have seen the greatest unfinished learning and where might you want to focus your efforts. This template is more useful really as a group discussion template after you've kind of pulled some of those key data points. Then the second step in the process is to really think more deeply about learning acceleration strategies. So we at the agency have taken a moment to really conduct some research and understand what the strongest research-backed learning acceleration strategies are out there, where LEAs might have the strongest success in seeing more than 1 year of growth in 1 year for students. And where we've really landed is 4 big categories. So first, the concept of supported teachers who are equipped to deliver excellence, getting more than 1 year of growth in 1 year. Second, rigorous instructional material that are designed to make up ground. Third, more time. And we know this is a strategy many of you are thinking about as well, including thinking about summer, high dosage tutoring, after school, or extended time in the school day. And then finally, family empowerment and engagement, and really thinking about the whole child. So if you scroll down below in this tab, what we've done is we've broken down each of those 4 big categories into a few subcomponents and learning acceleration strategies. So for example, supported teachers, we've broken down into the ability for teachers to implement strong Tier 1 instruction, particularly in reading, language arts, and math, deliver interventions and individualized support for students, as well as the concept of adding instructional support staff, because in many cases, really adding some paraprofessionals or other support staff can be critical to getting to that one-on-one and group support that's really needed for learning acceleration. We've broken down here as well instructional materials and some strategies for extended time, as well as family engagement. And now for each of these strategies, we have written up a set of reflection questions that your leadership team can go through. So thinking about whether the strategy is present at your school or LEA, thinking about the level of current need to invest in that strategy, the effort level at a rough level that you might see yourself needing to invest to enact this strategy fully. And then once you've actually done a bit of that reflection, the need analysis, you're then able to go ahead and prioritize each of these strategies. Again, the goal of conducting this learning acceleration reflection is so that you're really making a funding plan that is rooted in the top strategies for learning acceleration. And finally, we have a third tab here to help you bridge what you did in those first two steps in that data reflection, in the learning acceleration strategy reflection, into a funding plan. So you'll see some of the reflection questions here really converted into more of a resource and funding lens question. You'll be able to reflect on these questions and then input dollar amounts for each of the big categories that we discussed on that last tab. And we've also included some additional reflection questions here. So for example, if you decide to add instructional support staff, who will benefit from the instructional support staff that you've added? Are there particular campuses, grade levels, or content areas where you want to focus that additional staff? Some additional reflection questions, for example, are there other grants available to support this work? We've also linked in an overview of relevant TEA programs that you might already be tapping or might consider tapping. Considering whether you are wanting to fund this particular strategy fully with your federal funds or other funding as well. Thinking about the sustainability of this strategy long-term, as well as alignment overall with your goals as a district. And thinking about operational considerations, for example, staffing or scheduling of taking a given strategy. So this planning template kind of gives you a quick way to have some of the key conversations as a district and pipe in some estimates for what you might actually spend in alignment with your learning acceleration strategies. And as you pipe in those dollar amounts, those will actually flow to this front overview page. And you'll be able to sort of see at a high level, how much are we investing in each category? How does this line up against our key priorities as an LEA? And how does this actually check against our own amount of expected federal funds? So we hope you find this resource useful. I also want to note that my team is absolutely here to support if you want more information on the learning acceleration strategies or resources on how to enact some of those strategies. I will go ahead and drop the email address for our program into the chat as well. And I'm noticing just a couple of comments here that it's hard to make a copy of the document. So we'll make sure that that is possible as well before the end of this session. Thank you all. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out at the email address that I'll drop into the chat. And back to you, Corey.
All right, appreciate that, Mega. I know the questions are going to come up. Are you required to use TEA's planning process? No, you're not required to use it. It's an option. It's what we feel is a very strong option that meets the compliance requirements for planning. We are going to be actually required to monitor your compliance with the planning, with the different plans and the requirements and components of each of the plans. Part of that monitoring will be looking at random validation of random districts that are selected to look at your process you went through. And if you follow this type of process that TEA is offering to you, your compliance validations will go relatively smoothly because we know the process, we know the steps that are built in. So if you can have documentation, you're following this process, it will make the compliance piece go relatively smooth for you at the district level. So we're going to jump back into the other slide presentation. So give me just a second and put the share screen back up. All right, we're going to jump into the first plan and talk about the requirements that came out in the interim final rules. This is the LEA use of funds plan. So what we want to look at is a little bit of the timeline to start with. So TEA released the announcement of the ESSER 3 funding and the allocation amounts on April 27th. We followed that by releasing the application on April 28th. Your use of funds plan is incorporated into your LEA grant application. So you have, by rule, 90 days from the date that we release allocations to submit your plan to TEA for review and approval. Since we incorporated it into your application, this is your application deadline of July 27th of 2021. At that point, your application is with the agency. Your plan is considered to be submitted. We will review and negotiate your application, and then we will issue you a notice of grant award. Once you receive the notice of grant award on your application, you're then required to post your LEA uses of funds plan to your local website within 30 days of getting that NOGA. You will notice in the application itself, there is a question where you will be giving us the URL to your LEA website where that plan will be posted. When we issue a NOGA, starting 31 days later, we will start monitoring these plan requirements. And we will be going to the website that you give us in your application to pull down your LEA uses of funds plan and do random validations where we will look at various compliance requirements, whether it's the components, whether it's the planning process, whether it's the fact that you actually did post the plan within 30 days as required. We at the state are required to monitor compliance with all those pieces and all the programmatic pieces of the ESSER 3 program. So the random validations, because you're required to post your plan to the website within 30 days, the random validation will not require a lot of additional work for LEAs based on some of the different requirements. We have access to your plan. You've told us in the application exactly where to find it. So we have access to your plan. We'll see if it was posted within 30 days. We'll pull the plan down and start doing pieces of the random validation. There's other components of the compliance monitoring, such as the planning process you followed, where we will be reaching out to you and requesting certain documentation be submitted for review. Either type of validation, you will get a closeout letter in the end when it's completed, when we've completed the review, telling you that it met compliance or it needs improvement in certain areas. So in the final rules, there are 4 required components of your LEA use of funds plan. So every LEA that receives ESSER 3 funding is required to develop the plan and submit it to the state education agency, which is us at TEA, on a reasonable time frame determined by the state, and make publicly on the LEA website a plan for the use of ARP ESSER 3 funds. The reasonable timeline is further defined in the rule that it must be within 90 days. So that is why we have given you the full 90 days to submit your application to the agency with that due date of July 27th. So the first requirement is to the extent which and how funds will be used to implement prevention and mitigation strategies based on CDC guidance. Since this requirement says to the extent which and how, you are not required to use ESSER 3 funds on prevention and mitigation strategies related to CDC guidelines. But if you do, you will be describing in your plan how those funds are being used to meet this category. So in your application, you have Program Schedule 3013, which has Section A and Section B, which is all the allowable uses of ESSER 3 funds. And you're telling us in the application by year, either pre-award, year 1, year 2, or year 3 of the life of the money, you're telling us by year how you're going to use the ESSER 3 funds. Then in the second program schedule, 3014, there is a question D1, which is specifically addressing this plan requirement. So if you're spending money on prevention and mitigation strategies related to CDC guidelines, you will describe in D1 the amount of money and the types of activities that you have marked in the program schedule 3013. Because the wording in the rule is to the extent which and how funds will be used, there is a statement in the application on question D1 that allows you to just put a one-sentence response to that question stating you're not using ESSER 3 funding for this purpose. So this is the only requirement that has an option. But because of the wording, you are not required to use money for prevention and mitigation. If you do, you're going to address it in D1 of the application and explain how you're using the funding for this requirement. The second requirement, notice the wording is different, says how the LEA will use funds. So this is required. So element 2 of your plan is how you will use funds that you're reserving under Section 2001 E1. This is the 20% set aside to address learning loss and the lost instructional time. So this is your 20% set aside for learning loss and loss of instructional time, where you must be spending at least 20% of your funds for the implementation of evidence-based interventions, such as summer learning or summer enrichment programs, extended day programs, after school programs, or extended school year programs. Wording in federal regulations is always important. So in this requirement and in the statute, it lists these types of evidence-based interventions. These are the recommended uses, but you will notice that the requirement says such as summer learning, summer enrichment, extended days, after school, or extended school year. The wording such as does not limit you to only these type of evidence-based interventions, but this is required in statute and it's required in the rule. So these are the specific types of evidence-based interventions for learning loss that we are looking for. These are the types of activities that auditors and monitors will be looking for. So the second component of your plan is describing how you're going to spend that 20% set aside for these types of activities. Okay, people are telling me the slides are frozen. So here we're on requirement 2. That should be what you're seeing. So 20% of your funding has to be set aside for these types of evidence-based intervention activities. And the second component of your plan is describing how you will use that set aside. So this is found also in Program Schedule 3014 in your application. You're going to describe the types of activities that you're using to meet that 20% set aside. Now, again, in Program Schedule 3013, you've marked all the allowable activities. So question B2 in Program Schedule 3014 gives you the option to describe, and it's a required field, how you're spending that set aside money for these types of activities. And you must provide a description there. And in the instructions to the question, it identifies the specific allowable uses on Schedule 3013 that you might have marked, and you're required to have marked at least one of that group of activities. So in the question B2, we identify all the different allowable activities that make up this requirement. So you have to have marked at least one of those in the application on 3013, and then in 3014 B2, you're going to be describing those activities. So component 2 of your plan was describing the 20% set aside. Component 3 is describing how you're going to spend the remaining funds. So question 3, which is provided in the application, we're collecting the information in the application through program schedule 3013 Part A and Part B. So in your application on 3013 Part A and Part B, where we've listed all the statutory allowable activities, and you're telling us by time frame when you're planning to spend your ESSER 3 funds on that allowable activity, those 2 questions in the 3013 program schedule are giving us the response to component 3 of your plan, because it's telling us how you're spending the remaining ARP ESSER 3 funds. So there's not a specific narrative question in the application to collect this component, because we already know the information through those 2 questions, A and B, on schedule 3013. The next narrative question is for part 4, your last component in your uses of funds plan. And this is the other part of the 20% set aside. So your 20% set aside in component 2 is the learning loss and impact of lost instructional time activities around those types of evidence-based activities around summer programs, extended school day, extended school year. But the second half of that requirement in statute is that you must address the academic impact of lost instructional time to respond to the academic, social, emotional, and mental health needs of all students, and particularly those student groups who've been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And those student groups are your students from low-income families, students of color, English learners, children with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness, children in foster care, and the migrant students. So these are the student groups that have been broken out by USDE and identified as the students who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So in component 2, you were addressing the evidence-based activities around summer programs, tutoring, summer enrichment programs, extended day, extended week, extended school year, after school programs. You're looking at the evidence-based activities around learning loss. But component 4 is the other piece of that statutory requirement of how you're addressing not only the academic, but also the social, emotional, and mental health needs of students in these particular student groups. So in your application, we're collecting this information on schedule 3014 in question B3, where you're going to describe again the activities that you've marked in the uses of funds section in schedule 3013. So I know in the application this is a little confusing because the application kind of bounces back and forth between 2 schedules. We already had the application pretty much developed when USDE released these rules that actually added requirements. So in the federal ESSER 3 statute, we have 60 days from the date that USDE awards the funds to TEA. We had 60 days by statute to get the allocations available in the application released. At about day 28, USDE releases an interim final rule that puts additional requirements into the application process. So there was no way we could start over on the application without going to a straight paper application like you did with ESSER 1. And none of us wanted to go back to a paper application that you had to fill out and then email into the agency. We wanted to keep this application being available in eGrants the way we had started it. So your 4 components of your plan are all reflected in the 2 application schedules, program schedule 3013 and 3014. They're not exactly in the order that the IFR lists them, but all 4 of these requirements are covered and are collected in your application. Now, there's a couple of additional requirements that are in the plan that are identified in USD's rules. And the first one is kind of the big requirement for most people right now because of the timing. It's a short timeline, even with having 90 days to get this planning process completed and get the application submitted. That's really a short timeline to do the type of meaningful consultation with stakeholders that is required in the federal rules. So there is a requirement that the LEA must engage in meaningful consultation with stakeholders and give the public an opportunity to provide input into the development of its plan. So the rules reiterate the word meaningful consultation over and over, and actually even go into an explanation of why the department felt it was important to really stress this stakeholder engagement process. So you're going to be looking at a meaningful consultation process, public notice with an opportunity for public comment. The question comes up very frequently, how do you have to meet the public notice and public comment requirement? Well, you should have some type of process and procedure in your LEA for providing public notice. Many people will put this as an information item on a local board meeting and have an informational presentation at the board meeting. They may take questions live at the board meeting. They may take input from the field, give them a review and comment opportunity through some other type of public notice, but they may be offering a survey, they may be offering questionnaires, but you have to have a process. And this is why I've been telling LEAs, my recommendation is you need a policy at the local level that defines how you provide public notice to your parents and community on various requirements. And then you have a way every time you have one of these requirements of following that policy, and it stands up to an auditor. You know, auditors are going to see multiple ways of collecting public comment. One of the things they're going to see very frequently is this idea of providing the information at a public board meeting, but that's not the only way you can provide public notice and take comment. If you have a written policy or at least a written procedure that you're following for public comment, and you're following that process every time, then that will stand up to an auditor regardless of what your process is. Now, who are the required stakeholder groups? You have a very extensive list in the public rule. Basically, the list on the left, you must include all of these groups in your stakeholder engagement, your stakeholder input process. So you must include students. It's one of the groups that people forget about including the most. But in the use of ESSER 3 funds, students are listed first as the stakeholder group that has to be included in this meaningful consultation process. Families, school and district administrators, specifically including your special education administrators, teachers, principals, other school leaders, other educators, and your school staff. That list on the left, that is required of everyone. Every LEA, no matter size or location, is required to have input from this group of stakeholders, and every LEA should have people that fit these categories. So can a person meet more than one category? Yes, under ESSER, we allow that. So you can have stakeholder input, and the person providing input may check off more than one category. That's fine under ESSER. That's not always the rules under some other programs. For this purpose, under ESSER, a person providing input and participating in the meaningful consultation process may represent more than one group. Now, the group on the right, to the extent these groups are in your LEA, you must also include tribes, civil rights organizations, including disability rights organizations, and then stakeholders that represent the interest of any of these certain student groups. So children with disabilities, English learners, children experiencing homelessness, children in foster care, migrant students, children who are incarcerated, and any other underserved student. So the column on the left is required of all LEAs for your stakeholder engagement process. Column on the right is required to the extent the groups are available within your LEA. So I've had several questions about civil rights organizations, including disability rights. What makes up those groups? Well, some of the suggested organization you would be looking for is NAACD, NAACP, MALDEF, Disability Rights Texas, those types of organizations that will be available for providing input in some areas may not be available in other areas. Most of you will have stakeholders that represent the interest of special groups of students. You may not have a special interest group for every category, but you will likely have someone representing the special interest of some of those categories of student groups. And of course, tribes at the top, many of you are not going to have tribes within your LEA, but there are a few across the state. So the column on the right, the main thing to remember is that if these organizations or these groups are available or are in your LEA, then you must include them as well. If they are not, you may exclude them from your process, but do make sure that you attempt to find out if you have any of these groups. And if you do have any of those groups, make sure you include them in your stakeholder engagement process. So we've gotten lots of questions about stakeholder input already in the FAQ. So if you were to go to the FAQ document and you look at grant requirements questions 16 through 21, you will see several questions that you can review related to the stakeholder input process. And I'm going to go through just a couple of them. So if you look at question 16, I'm being asked quite often, what's the minimum that you must do to meet the stakeholder input requirement for the ESSER plans? I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not going to tell you the minimum you have to do. Every LEA must determine if your stakeholder input process meets the minimum requirements, both in the statute and the federal rule, because TEA will randomly conduct compliance validations of the process. But you need to be following your process to meet your needs, and based on those needs and based on the input that you're receiving, you at the LEA level need to be making that decision of when you have sufficient stakeholder input to develop your plan. So what do we recommend as best practice for stakeholder input? Our recommendation for stakeholder input that best practice might include some type of community-wide public notice having a public notice with a comment process, maybe with some type of a survey that you're gathering input from the various stakeholder groups. So some type of community-wide notice with the option for a survey. Your survey would have probably all these stakeholder group options where the person providing input can select which categories they fall into. But showing a wide public notice with some type of survey or comment process helps you document that you attempted to receive input from all the different student groups. In addition to that, best practice would be to have small group meetings or public forums. That's going to also strengthen your process as you're having smaller meetings where you can get sometimes more meaningful input. Your comment process or some type of survey is going to give you broad general input to be able to meet all the compliance requirements. But these smaller meetings, smaller public forums is where you're probably going to receive the more rich feedback and discussion on the questions that you want to ask your community about the uses of funds and about your planning process. Regardless of what type of process you follow, be sure you document that you had all the required stakeholder groups included and that you provided meaningful consultation with your community. ESSER 3 is the largest federal grant we've had in the 26 years I've been working federal grants at the agency. We know up front it will be audited from the federal level. We at the state are required to audit the LEAs. We're required to do program compliance monitoring. But in this money at the federal level, there is a lot of money for Office of Inspector General for audits. Texas receives one of the largest allocations in the country. We know we will be audited, and we are required to be auditing and monitoring compliance of the district. So document the process as you go. Question 18 talks about a deadline for stakeholder input to develop your plan. So you are required to gather stakeholder input during your planning process before you submit the plan to TEA and post it on your website. So the LEA use of funds plan that you're working on as part of the application has to receive stakeholder input before you submit the application. So are you going to be finished with your stakeholder input process and finished with finalizing some of the requirements to your plan when you need to submit your application to the agency? Maybe not. So we do cover that issue in question 20. Could the LEA submit a base plan and amend it later as it continues to work through the best approaches to gather community involvement? Yes, because of the timelines, we will allow that. But you must be able to document you have done some level of stakeholder input before you submit the application. But you can submit a base plan in the application and then amend it and update it as you need to, as you receive more input. Also to note, the return in-person instruction continuity of service plan that we're going to talk about in a few minutes has a requirement to be revised and reviewed and revised every 6 months. So that's going to be an ongoing consultation process on that plan. Then there is a question 21 in the FAQ, SSAs. We do have some SSAs forming for the ESSER 3 grants. And so we do address in the FAQ what this stakeholder input process would look like for an SSA. And basically you have flexibility, but your written SSA agreement is going to determine what the role is of the fiscal agent and what the role is of those member districts. So the FAQ does have several questions about the stakeholder engagement process. There's several more coming in that we'll be adding to the FAQ document as well, because that stakeholder input process is one of your big requirements for the development of this plan, well, for the development of both plans, actually. And so you want to really focus on that and ensure that you're meeting those compliance requirements, because as we already said, it will be monitored. You also have formatting requirements. So your use of funds plan must be in an understandable and uniform format, to the extent practical, written in a language that parents can understand, or if not practicable, orally translated to the parent. And upon request by a parent who's an individual with a disability, be provided an alternative format accessible to that parent. So your use of funds plan is written into your application. So you have an option of how you make that final version of the plan available to parents. We are going to allow you to post the 2 program schedules of the application, or you can post a summary document of that information. We'll accept either one. My recommendation is really now, the more we've worked on these planning requirements and gotten into the detail of the federal rule, my recommendation is that you pull the information out of the program schedules to the application, and you go to those 4 sections that we've talked about briefly earlier, and you summarize that information into more of a planning document that would be something that parents might be more accustomed to seeing. So it needs to be in an understandable and uniform format. Again, we'll accept posting of either one, but the recommendation now is that you transpose that information into a document to post. To the extent practicable, written in a language parents can understand, or if not practical, orally translated to the parent. So most cases, the plan will be required to be translated into Spanish and into other languages in other districts, depending what your local policy is. You have a local policy probably for translation of documents. There may be a threshold number of families speaking a certain language before you provide translation, written translation. You can follow whatever your policy is on how you translate and what you translate. But again, in most instances, this plan will need to be translated into Spanish. And in some instances, it will be translated into other languages as well. So whatever your normal policy is for determining what language you translate documents into, you will follow that policy. And at least at our side, at the monitoring we are going to be doing, we will be looking for you to be following that written translation policy that you have in your LEA. If you're not providing a translation to another language, you do need to document that you have made it available orally. That will be something that will be looked at in the compliance requirements. And then also document that if you receive any requests from a parent who is an individual with a disability, that you have provided alternative formats. So these plan requirements are in the rules, and so they carry the weight of statute, and so they will be also monitored at the state and federal level. So make sure and pay attention to these. And then the last requirement is the posting of your plan to your website within 30 days of receiving your notice of grant award. And again, this is posting either the 2 program schedules that contain all the elements of the plan, or posting a summary document of the contents of those 4 sections of the program schedules. Remember, you're telling us in your application the web URL to find this plan. That's where we're going to be looking. And so you're reporting in the application where you will post the plan within 30 days. And then just remember that it will be monitored. A lot of the compliance monitoring, we will simply go to your website, pull down your plan, and you will hear from us at the end of the process, where we have actually told you that we found your plan to be compliant or needing improvement, because there's no need to reach out and contact you for more information on your plan because we already have everything available. There will be other validations that are being monitored that we will need to contact you for information that you will provide. So you have the 4 components that are required in the plan, and then you have the requirement for stakeholder input, the formatting requirements, and the web posting requirement. So again, the application schedules, you can go to the TEA Grant Opportunities webpage, and there is a PDF version of the application. Just a reminder that PDF application is for planning purposes only. You cannot submit the PDF version. You must go into eGrants and submit the application through eGrants the same way you submit all your other federal applications that are in the eGrant system. When you do go into the grant opportunities page, the name of the application is 2020-2023 ARP ESSER 3 federal grant application. It does help if you know how the application is named so that you know how to actually find that grant application. On that page for the application, you will find additional links for additional information, including the allocations and this PDF version of the application itself, which is for planning purposes and training purposes only. So we're going to real quickly go to grant opportunities. Many ways you can search for it. I just go to funding subject area and go to disaster funding, hit search, and it will be the bottom one that always comes up on the bottom. So you see the 2023 ARP ESSER 3 federal grant application. You click on the little hourglass and it gives you the information about the grant. Scroll down to this section that says application support information. You can find the general guidelines to the program guidelines, program specific provisions and assurances, and here's sample application. And this will give you this PDF version of the application. I just want to quickly talk about a couple of things in the application. You scroll down, it looks very familiar to those of you who use eGrants. This is program schedule 3013. The program plan, part A and B here is the allowable uses of funds that we talked about. And you will see for each allowable use of funds that's in statute, you're going to tell us the period of time where you will spend money for that activity. Pre-award, the first option is March 13th, 2020 through the date you submit your grant application. And then you have options for the 2021 school year, the 21-22 school year, 22-23 school year, and 23-24 school year. It tells you on each line where the summer programs are included, or if you're not going to spend money on that activity, you mark the bottom box, not applicable. So this question A, and then you'll go into question B, which is just a continuation of the uses of funds. This is where you're telling us with these check marks, you're meeting the component 3, how the other money, not the 20% set aside, is being expended. You're telling us how all the money is being expended in these schedules. And then you go into schedule 3014. And this is where you have, oh, that's still 3014 here. This is where you have the other plan requirements. So the section B, the minimum set aside requirements, the dollar amount goes in 1. 2 and 3 are where you're meeting the other program plan requirements, where you have to provide a description of the 20% set aside for learning loss in question B2. And then in B3, this is the academic, social, mental behavior, mental health type activities. You will notice in these questions, we have identified for you the specific questions on 3013 that make up those requirements. And you have to put at least one response in one of those items, and you then describe it here. These two pieces, B2 and B3, are part of your plan requirements. What I want to talk about a little bit more is in one of the budget schedules. We're getting a lot of questions on it. And it's on payroll, it's this part 4 that talks about confirmation of payroll requirements. This is an assurance that is required. The application cannot be approved without this assurance being checked if you're putting any money in payroll. We know that payroll is allowable under ESSER 3 and is very broad and flexible under ESSER 3. So in the application, I do just want to hit that there is a statement in here that says the grantee further describes it is in compliance with federal supplement not supplant program provisions. That's kind of shocking people because there is no supplement not supplant for ESSER 3. That's correct. There is none, so you are compliant with it. You still have to check this box. So that's as you're planning and you're going through your planning process on use of funds, don't let this one statement in this confirmation assurance derail your planning if you're wanting to use money for payroll. So we're going to move on. Talk about the return to in-person instruction and continuity of services plan requirements. So the new rules stress that this plan for return to in-person instruction is required of all LEAs, including those that already returned to in-person instruction. There was a lot of question early on because we have a lot of schools in a lot of states that will never be in person this entire school year. They will do the entire year remote. So this requirement, when it first came out under ESSER 3, people thought it was only for LEAs that had not gone back to in-person instruction. But the rules very clearly state it is required of all LEAs, including those that have already returned to in-person instruction. The requirements are two basic requirements for content. The first one is focused on the safe return to instruction. So the plan has to describe how you will maintain health and safety of students, educators, school, and LEA staff. And this includes to the extent that you have adopted policies around CDC recommendations, you have to include a description of those policies. I know lots of districts now have policies around masks, whether they're required or not. You have a policy around masks. Masking is one of the CDC safety recommendations. You would have to describe that policy in the plan. So a lot of people ask, what are the safety recommendations by CDC? There is a list of them. Masks, modifying facilities for social distancing processes, hand washing, respiratory etiquette, cleaning and maintaining the facilities, contact tracing, diagnostic screening testing, efforts to provide vaccination to the school community, appropriate accommodations for children with disability related to health and safety, and coordinating with state and local health officials. Chances are you do have a policy on at least one or more of these CDC recommended areas. So a description of that policy has to be included in the return to school plan. Second part of the requirements for content is a description of the continuity of services. So you must address how you will ensure continuity of services, but not limited to services to address students' academic needs, student and staff social, emotional, mental health, and other needs, which may include student health and may include food services. So two main content requirements on your return to in-person instruction continuity of services plan. The first is health and safety, talking about all your policies and decisions around those CDC guidelines. The second one being the continuity of service piece, how you're addressing academic needs and students, staff, social, emotional, mental health needs. So you've got a lot of this information already. You were required to have had a plan for returning to in-person instruction back in the fall. And this is very familiar to what we've just talked about in the LEA use of funds planning process. So you should see some alignment between your two plans, and you should have some of the same information because you're addressing how you're going to use the money for social, emotional, mental health and the use of funds plan. And here you're describing those services. So you should see some overlap and some alignment between your plans, and they're going to align back to the plan you developed in the fall. Now, the return to in-person instruction plan does have a 6-month review requirement in the rules. You must review your plan every 6 months, and as appropriate, revise it. And that requirement goes through the end of the ESSER 3 grant period, which is September 30th, 23. Okay, before this date starts confusing people, the actual grant period of ESSER 3 is through September 30th of 23. So that's where your 6-month review requirement ties to a date. We all know you have an additional 12-month carryover period to continue using the funds, but the rule says this every 6-month review goes through the actual end of period of availability, which is September 30th, 23, even though, yes, you still have an additional 12 months through September 30th, 24 to expend the funds. So this review process every 6 months must include the public comment process if you're making revisions to the plan. In addition to that, you have to take into consideration the timing and any significant changes to CDC guidance that they issue about reopening schools. So if CDC puts out a significant change in their guidelines, you are going to need to review your plan. If you, when you're doing this 6-month review, you determine you do need to make a revision, you have to do stakeholder input, public comment. You have to incorporate that process into your 6-month review. So if you revise your plan during that 6-month required review period, you have to make sure you're addressing each of the aspects for safety that are in the current CDC guidelines at the time of your review. So you may be adding something if they've had a significant change to the CDC guidelines, or if they have updated their safety recommendations at the time you're doing the revision to the plan, you have to address those updated safety recommendations in your plan as well. Now, the statute talked about a prior plan that met the statutory requirements could meet the ESSER 3 return to instruction plan requirements. So initially, we thought your return to instruction plan back in the fall was going to meet this requirement as long as you posted it on your website and you had done a public review and comment period. The rules clarified it a little bit more detailed. So if you had the plan developed prior to the enactment of the American Rescue Plan Act, and that plan meets the statutory requirement for public input and posting of the plan, but if it does not address each one of the safety aspects from CDC, as part of your 6-month periodic review process, you must then revise the plan with those requirements. Or if it's been more than 6 months since you reviewed that plan, you have to go ahead and review that plan and make any revisions now. So although the prior plan may work for you, if it's been more than 6 months since you reviewed it, the rules do require you to go ahead and do that 6-month periodic review now and make any necessary revisions to the plan. Same formatting requirements, understandable uniform format, extent practicable, written in a language parents can understand or orally translated, and alternative formats provided upon request to parents who are individuals with disabilities. So the same format requirements as your use of funds plan, and basically the same web posting requirements. Must be posted to your website within 30 days of receiving the notice of grant award on your application. And we will be looking at those plans and monitoring compliance with those plans as well. So again, if you want to submit questions to the FAQ document, they are available. The form is available to you on the website. Again, the questions are coming in really fast, even during this presentation. So it's going to take a few days to get caught up. And then they do go through the required review and approval process before we post answers. So it is going to take a few days to get caught up on all your questions into the FAQ. Also know that we get many questions who are very similar, just slightly different wording. We do basically only answer one question. We may adjust the wording in the question slightly. We're not going to answer the same question multiple times, even though the question may be worded slightly different. So if you don't see your exact question, still look at the new questions in the FAQ and you'll find a response that probably fits your question pretty soon. The FAQ document is programmed where if a change to a response happens, it does flag the entire question in red text for 5 days. And if I add new questions, which is again almost daily, new questions are flagged green text for 5 days. So if you read it now while it's relatively short, and then you just kind of stay up on it every day or two, you'll easily be able to identify any questions that have had a change to the response or an updated response in red, and any new questions will be in green. So you can submit questions at the link there. So we've got a few minutes. We're going to try to hit some of your questions. I'm not going to be able to hit all of them. That's pretty much probably guaranteed, but we will add additional questions to the FAQ document as well. So there's a lot of questions in the FAQ. Some of them you voted up. First question, we're being asked this quite a bit. The slide presentation talks about CDC's guidelines, including the universal and correct wearing of masks. Your local board's already made wearing of mask optional. Will that matter? It's not going to keep your plan from being approved or anything, but since you do have a board policy on it, you do have to address that in your plan. So in that section of your plan, you will simply say, as of X date, the local board policy is that wearing a mask are optional. It's not going to impact your funding. Will new school buses be an allowable expense with ESSER 3 funds? ESSER 3 funds is your planning for the allowable use of funds plan. You have to consider all your needs. Basically, very broad, very flexible uses of funds, but there's some key provisions. You have to, number one, make sure the cost is reasonable and necessary. You must tie the cost to a need identified as a result of the pandemic, and you must be able to tie the cost to one of the statutory allowable activities. So as long as you can do those three things, you generally can. There are ways you may be able to buy a new bus. You justify it to the pandemic. You need more transportation routes. You need more buses because you have to put social distancing guidelines. You have social distancing guidelines for students riding the buses. So the bus capacity is limited under the CDC guidelines. So you align all that to an allowable use of funds, and then you tie it to the CDC guidelines in your justification, and you show the cost is reasonable and necessary, and it could be an allowable activity. Another question about school board decides masks are optional. Does that impact the plan or validation process if CDC is still saying masks are recommended or required? Again, it's not going to jeopardize your funding, but you do have to address that board policy in the plan. In a validation, we may ask for a copy of the board minutes where that was passed. That documents that is a policy, that is a board decision. It's not going to make you non-compliant because you don't require masks, as long as that's been a policy or a board decision. Just have it documented. Can money be used to update an HVAC system for a building being renovated for a future campus site? Same answer on allowable. Reasonable, necessary, tied to a need identified by the pandemic. Justify it as related to the pandemic. Any of the allowable activities that you can tie to CDC guidelines, the recommendations by CDC for safety, the issue around social distancing is going to be a valid justification for several different types of costs, but you do have to be able to tie that activity to either an allowable use, well, both an allowable use and to a need caused by the pandemic. Do you plan for the entire amount of ESSER 3 or plan for the first allocation? You can plan for the whole thing and kind of get your planning requirement done, but your application is only for the first 2/3 of your allocation. But you can incorporate the full amount into your planning process and do that plan all at once. Your application is only the first 2/3 of your funding, but you can go ahead and design your plan for the full amount. You will get the full amount. It's just USD will not release the remaining 1/3 until the state plan has been submitted and is negotiated and approved by USDE, and that's not due till June. So it's going to be late summer probably before that remaining third comes around. Can you use the stamp in date to begin spending the funds, or do you need to wait until you receive a NOGA? That's a key question for you as you're developing your plan, but the answer is that depends on your local policy. I can tell you it runs about 50-50. About half the districts allow you to start spending funds on submission of the application. About the other half of the districts require you to get a notice of grant award. Either way, you do have pre-award authorized back to March 13th of 2020, and you can start obligating funds under that pre-award statute. Please explain the maintenance of equity requirement in more detail. Unfortunately, I can't because we have no guidance and no information on it. What I can tell you is maintenance of equity is a new provision in the ESSER 3 statute. We feel it was intended to perhaps not allow as much supplanting at the state and local level, even though supplanting is explicitly required in all 3 ESSER programs. The maintenance of equity provision, at least, is in statute to ensure that high needs campus, high poverty campuses are not reduced funding or staffing at a higher level than other campuses. Unfortunately, we don't have any guidance from USDE. For the last 3 weeks, they've told us it'll be out next week, and we don't have it yet. Once we get that, we'll put a lot more information out because we know many of you have questions about that maintenance of equity provision. May we also put a public comment link on our website for 30 days for ESSER questions? Yes, locally you have that option as to how long your public comment period is, how you request public comment. You have a lot of flexibility, so definitely putting a link on your website where they can submit comments is one option you have. Provide more detail on the allowable use, other activities that are necessary to continuing to employ existing staff of the LEA. Is it possible to cover teacher salaries for a part of the funds to allow district to free up local funds? If you will go to the FAQ document and go to the allowable uses section, question AU10, specifically talks about teacher salaries, staff salaries paid out of ESSER 3 funds. And I even basically give you a second paragraph in that response that tells you how to document it. I tell you how to tie it to that specific allowable use and statute, and how you can document salary. Salary is going to be very flexible. Almost any position within the district for salary can be tied to that very last allowable use that was in the question. And if you go to the FAQ allowable use question 10, I've spelled that all out in exactly how you can document the tie to the pandemic and to the allowable uses for you. Is there a specific format needs to be presented on the website, and does it have to be available in Spanish? The format that you post the plan on your website has to meet those statutory and rule requirements we just talked about. And does it have to be translated into Spanish? There are rules around translation that we just discussed. You have to make sure you're following your local translation policy. You should have a policy that spells out what you translate into what languages. You would be expected to follow that local policy. In many instances, yes, your plan will require being translated into Spanish. I will just say that. I get in trouble for saying that, but in most instances, it will have to be translated into Spanish. Other languages will be dependent on your local policy. Can we use the plethora of input we've gathered throughout 2021 as part of, oh, my questions are moving, as gathered throughout 2021 as part of meaningful consultation, or is there, Matt, you're moving them too quick. I can't read that quick. Hold on, I gotta find that question again. Okay, can you use the input you've gained throughout the school year for meaningful consultation, or is there a date from which you can use input? I'm going to say you are going to have input throughout this entire school year that will be beneficial to you in this process. In addition to that, you do need to have some type of specific process for input available now, because you know the specific plan requirements that you need to be addressing now. So I do feel you have to do some type of stakeholder input and gather information as part of your planning process now, but nothing limits you from using all the planning and all the consultation inputs you've received during the year. That all can be incorporated into developing your plan. Will class size reduction work for number 2? Sorry, I don't know what you're referencing number 2. I'm sure it's something on a slide that was on screen when you put this in. Submission due date is July 27th. If the submission is denied, will there be a resubmission date? July 27th is the deadline for submitting your application. That includes all the components of your uses of funds plan. It will be negotiated. Your application with those responses will be negotiated. There will not be a denial. You will get an approved plan. It may go back and forth through negotiation a little bit, but there's not going to be a denial where you have to totally start over and resubmit a plan. Because it's part of the application, it will be the normal review, negotiation, and then approval process, just like every other application. Do you need to cite evidence-based interventions for learning loss? The requirement is for evidence-based interventions. So some of the interventions included in your plan must meet that requirement of being evidence-based. Are ESSER 3 funds held at the district level or allocated to campus for discretionary spending? It should be a combination of both. The funds are very flexible. They can be used for district level uses. They can also be used for campus level uses. And we expect that you would be using your ESSER 3 funds, a combination, some for district-wide activities, some maybe at individual campuses to meet individual campus needs. Do you have a sample of what an acceptable stakeholder survey would include? I do not have a sample, but I can tell you TEA will be putting out a stakeholder input survey related to our state plan requirements, and I believe that survey is coming out the end of this week. So you will at least be able to look at that survey, fill it out, help us out, give us input, but it'll also give you an idea of the type of survey you might use. One thing about, a stakeholder input survey, ask the questions that you want input to, that you can change things, that you can actually use their input in the development of your plan. You don't need to ask a question on every single requirement, every single student group. Ask the things that are important to you that you need input on. And you all know the longer the survey, the fewer people are going to stick with it and fill it out. So, be aware of the length of your survey. Focus on questions that are going to gather you real input that you can actually utilize. But our state survey will be out the end of the week. It'll just give you an idea of what we're asking for. Will the 20% set aside be deducted from the initial amount or from the 2/3 amount of ESSER 3? Your application is for the first 2/3 of funding. So the 20% set aside you're addressing in the application is based on your application budget, which is only the first 2/3 of your funding. When you receive the remaining 1/3 toward the end of summer, early fall, you will be required to amend your application, which will be amending your budget, and it will be amending some of the responses on your program pages. When they decided to break the allocation into 2 pieces, there's just no way around that. You have to actually submit an application on what's available now, and then you'll have to amend later for the additional money. Are board members allowed to serve on a stakeholder group? Sure. You need more than just your local board, but board members can provide input in your stakeholder input process. Please clarify whether component 4 is specific to the 20% set aside. Component 4 in the uses of funds plan, that is the academic, social, mental health requirements. Yes, it is tied to the 20% set aside requirement. The 20% set aside is evidence-based academic type activities for learning loss. And the second piece of that 20% requirement is also those evidence-based social, emotional, mental health strategies as well. What is the process to receive TEA approval prior to approval of construction costs with ESSER 3 funds? Construction and remodeling renovation costs, as long as they can be tied to the pandemic, can be allowable. We had a few construction costs under ESSER 1. The approval process was an email process. We're already starting to get a lot more interest in construction and renovation under ESSER 3. Very soon, there will be a specific form that will be filled out with information attached to it and submitted by email to the grant support email address. Once that form is ready, that will come out in the FAQ with a link to the form and specific instructions of how to request prior approval of construction costs. Basically, in the prior approval request, the district or charter school has to describe the construction or renovation, describe how it's meeting a need that is caused by the pandemic, reasonable and necessary, and certifications of Buy American and meeting Davis-Bacon requirements. And it's a little bit of a narrative that's required because I have to have all that information to be able to give a prior approval. Key is that it is a prior approval, that you get that prior approval from the agency before you start the construction project that you're going to want to pay, or the renovation project you're going to want to pay with ESSER 3. Again, that form will be out hopefully by the end of the week, and it will be released in the FAQ. We'll also send a Gov delivery bulletin out announcing it when the form is ready. Can you pay students to attend summer school to incentivize their attendance? No. ESSER 3 is very flexible, but paying incentives is not allowed under any federal grant. That is a violation of federal grant regulations. Any type of incentive is a violation of federal grant regulations. So you cannot pay students to attend summer school. You cannot pay students who just graduated to incentivize them to go to college. No type of paying students any type of incentive would be allowed. And we've got at least 5 or 6 questions on that very thing. So I'm glad you asked that. In B2, could it include portable classroom size reduction to the addition of instructional paraprofessionals? B2 is describing the 20% set aside. You may be able to use those types of activities in B2 to justify the use of funds to meet the 20% set aside for learning loss and loss of instructional time. When they're talking about evidence-based strategies, they're more looking at strategies that align to that list. So as long as you had some of those activities in the list that you're also addressing, you would probably be fine with class size reduction, including paraprofessionals. But you do have to be able to show that those are evidence-based strategies that are going to address learning loss. So it's part of that's going to depend on your description and how you justify it. Is the application what you're calling the plan, or will we attach a separate plan to the application? The use of funds plan requirements are built into the application schedules. You will fill out the application and submit it. That will be reviewed. That will constitute TEA's review and approval of your uses of fund plan. When you get a notice of grant award, that will be the approval of the plan. Not two separate documents. All the components that are required in the plan, use of funds plan, are in the application questions. Now, when you get the notice of grant award and you have to post your use of funds plan, that's the point you have to make a decision. Are you going to post the two program schedules from the application that have all the required information, or are you going to create a summary document that you post for parents and community? Is the total set aside 20% for both or 20% total? It is a 20% set aside for learning loss and loss of instructional time. That includes evidence-based activities, which breaks out into the summer learning, the summer engagement, after school, extended year, and second bullet of the same requirement, which also address these social, emotional, and mental health needs of students and staff. It's one requirement, 120% set aside, two sub-bullets in the requirement. Will time and effort requirements apply to supplemented salary for allowable positions? Under ESSER 1, USD was extremely flexible about not requiring time and effort unless the position was split funded with another fund source that required time and effort. And we expect their answer to be the same for ESSER 3. You have enough money to be fully paying the full salary. At most, the time and effort would be a certification type statement. But under ESSER 1, USD did not require that. I can't say specifically because we don't have ESSER 3 guidance from USDE yet. So we don't have the level of detail. So we're kind of aligning to what their answers were related to ESSER 1. Some of the questions I've asked them already, they don't seem to understand why I'm asking. It's like we've already answered that under ESSER 1. Yes, they have. Tell me everything under ESSER 1 applies to ESSER 3, and I'll quit bugging you and asking questions. But they're two different programs. They're different federal statutes. We can't just automatically make the assumption that everything that applied under ESSER 1 will apply to ESSER 3. But right now, it does look like that may be the direction they're going. I got time for one last question. Will TEA release the methodology of how the funds were allocated between districts? We have surrounding ISDs receive more funding than ours, and the community is wondering why. Yes, we can. The methodology is in federal statute, and that's the methodology we followed. The reason other districts received more money, you probably see the same type of difference in their Title I allocation compared to your LEA. The federal formula is that you receive the same representative share of ESSER that you receive of Title I. And so it is a federal formula that calculates the allocations. I can have staff that do all that work, put out a funding allocation document for you. You can't just look at your neighboring district and say, we have the same demographics as the district 10 miles down the road. Why are they getting more money than us? This is based on Title I formula. Title I formula is based on census poverty data, which we all know those are calculated poverty children in the census data. You can't necessarily count the number of poverty kids. It's all formulas at the federal level. And that breaks down 4 different formulas that create a Title I allocation. And then the ESSER allocation takes your Title I allocation and you get the same proportionate share of ESSER that your Title I allocation is of the state Title I amount. But yes, we can put something out either in the FAQ or some other document that kind of explains that formula. With that, we do have to shut down. I am already 5 minutes late for another webinar. So we're going to go ahead and shut this down. Remind you to submit questions to the FAQ document. I know there's 100+ questions that we still didn't get to in today's training. Go to the FAQ document, look at the training schedule that's posted for you there. We do have an actual training how to complete the application scheduled on Friday. And then we have Q&A sessions for the next couple of weeks after that, which will just be live Q&A sessions. There will be no presentation, no review of slides. They will simply be live Q&A sessions where you can ask more questions. And if we need to extend those Q&A sessions beyond what's already scheduled, we will do that. Thank you for attending. Keep sending your questions in, and we do our best to try to get those updated in the FAQ as quickly as possible, but it will take a couple of days, and especially after this training, it's gonna be a few days to get caught up again. Thanks.